So hello and welcome to everyone to September's tea break, where we're looking at differences by art form in terms of engagement and how that's changed. I'm Oliver Mantell. I'm the Director of Evidence and Insight for the Audience Agency, and I'm a white male in a black t-shirt and blondish hair. Um, Apparently speaking to you from behind some kind of gauze or veil, but I'm not, I promise. It's just my camera being strange. But anyway, hello and welcome, and thank you for coming along. I'm joined by Ben Jeffries, our head of Scotland. So Ben, if you want to say a quick hello and intro.
Hello, as Ollie says, I'm head of Scotland, and my background is in producing theatre. Before that, I'm a bald, bearded, bespectacled, middle-aged man in a white shirt and a black sweater vest I've been single-handedly trying to bring back into style since about 1995.
And a very nice start of this too. Cool. So hope you've all got your tea or other drink handy, and we'll start going through what we're seeing in terms of audiences and sort of what's been going on by art form. But just by way of a little bit of background, um, regular tea breakers will have seen us talk about overall changes in sales and how the last the last time we had a conversation about this was the sort of the first time we'd seen sales get back to pre-pandemic levels, and we're about kind of 6% up on where they had been previously. But that was very much a kind of aggregate picture of where things were at. So this in this session, we'll be able to get into a little bit more detail about how that might vary for different types of product. And the reason we're able to do this now, and I should say this is a first view at this data, it's very, very fresh, um, is because for a while we've not had art form coding in audience answers. So we used to have it in Audience Finder, but once it stopped being a mandated service, we stopped asking people to fill out their sort of Excel spreadsheets of art form coding because we felt that was a little bit of a hefty requirement to make of people if they weren't using the service as a kind of mandated thing. But in the meantime, we have been working behind the scenes to work out how we can do it anyway. And because we had that big pool of pre-coded data and help from lovely people at the Turing Institute, and in particular a chap called Spiros Samothrakis, they helped us work out how to use AI to use the information we already had to suggest what art form the uncoded data in the database should be. So as a result, we've appended that to 1.1 million performances. So it's kind of glad we didn't have to do that by hand. And we've used that to then look at this cohort of 224 venues that have been consistently in audience answers, providing us data across at least 6 years. So that's the data set we're looking at. This process, because it's model data, isn't necessarily 100% accurate for every individual event. So we've got about 75% accuracy of allocation at the first tier. So that's our kind of top 15 kind of broad categories. We haven't as yet done it to the second tier, which is all the really, really detailed ones. But of course, we can do that on a more kind of ad hoc individual basis if we need to. So, and brace yourselves for a very heavy-handed visual metaphor. This was the missing piece of the puzzle because it allowed us to pull together and stitch together and then differentiate various different layers in the data in terms of what it was telling us. But before we start, the key thing to think about when we're looking at a comparison of overall sales data, particularly when you differentiate it, is that the amount of stuff being programmed by art form has also changed quite substantially. And if you don't know what's being programmed, you can't necessarily see what those sales figures mean in aggregate. So to start with a sort of the top level picture, what's been being programmed by these art forms? So this is just a really quick this is the proportions. This is what the proportions were in grey, and then the coloured bars, which will match to the lines you'll see in a second, then show the different art forms that are in the data set. So it's the 224 venues. It's across the country. It's lots of different types of venues, lots of different scales. But you can see that plays drama is a really big chunk of the data. Film is actually a relatively decent sized chunk. Lots of children's family work, general entertainment, music, other art forms. Some of the other ones are really quite small. So when we see big changes in those, we need to remember that it's changes on relatively small numbers. Also worth noting that the overall number of performed events has gone up by about a quarter in that time period, which I think in itself is quite an interesting thing. So what we're seeing is, yes, sales are up a little bit, but actually the number of activities that people could be buying for is up quite substantially. So here is the overall picture in terms of all those different art forms and how they've changed in terms of numbers of performances. So as you can see, there's a general drift upwards. That's the kind of 25% increase that we're seeing on average. But some of these art forms have increased a lot more than others. And just to break this chart down into slices to make it a bit more intelligible, essentially we're seeing three different things going on. We're seeing some art forms that are steady, some that are growing, and some where there's a kind of diversification of the type of thing programmed. And let's start with that last one. So what I mean by this is there's a higher proportion of events in categories which aren't just traditional, nice, neat, easy to box. It's play, it's drama, it's musical, it's dance, it's music or whatever. It's other stuff. It's stuff that fits into other categories or stuff that's a little bit less easy to classify. So there might be some circus in here, things like podcast discussions, like hypnotism, like all sorts of different types of art forms that sit within general entertainment and other art forms. So although we see those two lines moving a little bit separately in the last couple of years, for me, I think the thing that's most notable is that across both of them, in general, you're seeing an overall drift upwards. So there's a tendency for what's getting programmed to kind of be diversifying a bit. So that's the first point. Then the second one was that we're seeing a range of art forms where there's a fairly substantial growth in terms of numbers of events programmed. And leading the way on that is stuff like children and family events, Christmas shows, and indeed, to some extent, outdoor arts events, which are still getting ticketed through the venues that we're looking at data for. More participatory stuff as well. So there's a general drift in that direction in terms of the performances. And then we have a number of art forms, categories, that the number of performances are pretty steady compared to what it was. They may have been on a different journey over the years. You can see that some of them kind of went up and then came down again, or some were relatively low and then bumped. But in essence, they've ended up, roughly speaking, where they were in terms of number of performances. Worth noting, though, that they've ended up at that same sort of level, despite the fact that the overall number of performances has gone up 25%. So as a part of the mix, they're dropping a little bit. So we're seeing a bit less dance, literature, music, musical theatre, etc. I also think that sort of interesting in this mix is that film maybe started to look like a quite a useful prospect for lots of venues, partly because they didn't have to rely on large audiences turning up all at the same time. They could program a bit more. More spaced out audiences post-pandemic kind of works in film in a way that doesn't work for other art forms. But actually film sales have struggled a bit in general post-pandemic. And we're seeing that in cinemas and independent cinemas and all sorts of places. And sure enough, those number of performances have tapered back a bit over the last year. So, and in other places, we're seeing other shifts. So if that's a general picture of what's being programmed, then the question is, so what's happening to sales? So in terms of sales, we're looking at it in terms of a few standard measures that we always use. So the number of bookers, the number of bookings, the number of tickets, the amount of income, and then of course, the amount of income in real terms. So not just has the cash number of pounds gone up, but has it gone up relative to the cost of living or inflation, to be more precise. And across all of these, we could dwell on all of these in more detail, but essentially what we're seeing is a pretty consistent picture. So most things have gone up and stayed up, fairly flat for the last couple of years, with some gradual incremental improvement in certain areas. But the number of bookers has gone up, the number of bookings has gone up, number of tickets, and the amount of income. Now, there are a couple of, I think, interesting cases within the mix here. But also just to correct this income for inflation, the picture suddenly looks a lot less rosy. So rather than here, you can see that everything in nominal terms has at least got back to where it was in terms of income. Once you account for inflation, in real terms, actually, there's quite a few art forms that are below rather than above. So particularly like Christmas show, dance tips to being below, plays drama tips to being below in terms of income, despite the fact we saw that they were programming as much as they had. Um, so within this picture, the one that really sticks out to me, because it's hanging off the bottom of all of these measures, is Christmas show. So for Christmas shows, we're seeing a relatively, despite the fact that lots more events being programmed, when we're seeing a drop in bookings, tickets and income. So we go back to the beginning here, you see it's off the bottom consistently in the last couple of years. Um, Notably, 23, 24, so that will be kind of Christmas 2023, we saw a greater drop, and we are seeing that reflected in kind of consumer trends that people were spending less money that Christmas than they typically would, and they went on to spend a bit more the year after, and sure enough, those figures have gone back a bit. However, when we look at total actual spend, we can see here it's down about 20%, not just the kind of 3 or 4% that general consumer spending was down. So it feels like going out to shows at Christmas is much more vulnerable to that cost of living pressure than some other seasonal spending. Just to clarify on these, so I realize I didn't talk through the graph format at the beginning. So all of these are showing the relative numbers for that art form compared to whatever that art form was in 29-20. So that's why they all join at that first point and then they kind of fan out in different directions. So if they end up at around 100, they're around the same. If they're above 100, they've gone up proportionally and so forth to go down. So that's the overall picture we're seeing. But by and large, although that tells an interesting picture and we could dwell on it further, I think it becomes starker when you start to put some of these differences together and start to see what the overall pattern is. So let's dive into that. So this is looking at the number of tickets per performance. So in lots of cases, the number of performances have gone up, but the number of tickets potentially haven't a lot, or they haven't only a bit. And as a result, we're seeing quite a lot of art forms, and this is just a selected few from the list, but a lot of art forms where actually there's been substantial drops in how many people are attending any given performance. So particularly plays drama, children and family work, and Christmas shows. And of course, some of these are things that have been programmed quite a lot more. So what we're seeing is the number of tickets meant to be spread out across more events, as opposed to more events driving more tickets. So that I think is quite interesting. What we are seeing is that some art forms, musical theatre particularly, are seeing relatively fuller events, or sort of events with more people in them. Of course, that could be they're being put on in bigger venues, or it could just be they're selling better, or it could be that on average the smaller ones are not being programmed. There's different things that could be driving this, but nonetheless, we're seeing the average number of tickets per performance is up for those. Looking at the financial picture, we can also look at the income per ticket. So not just total income, not just total tickets, but actually, generally speaking, how's the price fluctuating in real terms? So this is accounting for inflation. And when I say accounting for inflation, I'm using the Bank of England inflation calculator. It's a very handy website. And essentially, all of these art forms, pretty much, are at best holding even in terms of income per ticket, and in most cases dropping back moderately substantially. So we're seeing, particularly for example, Christmas shows, it's dropping in value. The average price per ticket is dropping in value by about 13% in real terms across this period. So as well as all the other challenges we talked about, even when people are buying a ticket, they're not buying a ticket that's worth as much. We do see some interesting oscillations in this. I think this is partly about the way that what got programmed when happened during the pandemic. So it's as much, I think, things not being programmed and therefore what's left being bigger. So small musicals are probably stopped more and for longer than large musicals. Similarly, children and family work, I think there was a big push in the year post-pandemic to do more children and family work. That was some of the work that was most likely to get audiences out earliest and therefore was managing to get a higher yield. But yeah, it's quite an oscillating picture. So as a result of all of that, what we're seeing is um, there's broadly speaking four groups of art forms within this mix. So there's Christmas shows, as we've said, they're selling fewer tickets at a lower price, despite the fact they're putting on more performances. Net result, more performances with fewer people in them. Um, and Ben and I were having a chat the other day, and we think this could be partly just about extending runs because it keeps theatres live and occupied, and the marginal cost of an extra performance, like how much extra you have to pay per one more performance, isn't that high relative to the setup cost of a show. So maybe that's a reason why things have been stretched out. But what's not particularly been happening is that driving a bigger audience, particularly. It's just spread the audience out a bit. Um, there's some art forms where they've sold about the same number of tickets, but at a lower price. So plays, drama, and dance. And where we've seen the programming has held up for that, it's a slightly smaller part of the mix now than it was because the other performances have grown. Um, we see some things, particularly musical theatre, where they're selling more tickets, albeit slightly lower price, but it is enough that they're driving extra income. Um, and they're having more tickets per performance. So it's kind of the balance is slightly the other side of the line in terms of that. So they're kind of, I guess, looking a bit kind of healthier in that sense. And then finally, children and family work, where yes, they're selling more tickets, but it's also at a higher price, and there are more performances, but it's not enough more tickets for those performances not to be a little bit kind of thinned out in terms of number of people at each. So what we're seeing essentially is quite different behavior within different art forms. And of course, if we got into the next level of detail below that, we'd then be able to look at different strands of these. But we're not there yet. But you may have experience of what's happening at a more granular level within your own organizations. So just this is representing the same information in a different style, but essentially we're seeing more events is not particularly strongly correlated with more tickets. You're not seeing a nice clear line going bottom left to top right on this chart. So Christmas shows, lots more events, but actually substantially fewer tickets. Whereas some other things are the same or fewer events, but many more tickets, like musical theatre. But we can see these four groups sort of clustered together. And similarly, we talked about the tickets being thinned out, and that's why you're getting a bit of a line going the opposite direction on this one, where by and large, more events is linked to fewer tickets per performance. We will make all these slides available to you so you can sort of dwell on the particular details. I'm aware we've gone through quite a few different visuals on the way through, but then finally, if we're looking at that kind of ticket yield, we're seeing most things are actually below in terms of real terms ticket yield, the exception being children and family. But obviously there's a difference between getting a slightly lower yield but selling more tickets and those like Christmas show where you're selling less at a lower price as well. So what does that mean? To some extent, it's a first sort of break into the data, so we then need to explore it further and explore it based on your thoughts and feedback. But I think there's a few things that we can say. One is that we're seeing overall programming is changing. So we're seeing those proportions changing, we're seeing volumes changing, and we are seeing differences by art form in that change. So things which are differentiating, growing, or more steady. There's this kind of running to stand still effect going on, like more activity, but actually pretty much similar outputs in terms of overall sales. Some art forms, there's much stronger picture going on, musical theatre and music, particularly musical theatre. I think once we get into that, some of that detail we just looked at, and clearly some financial challenges, which are not just the overall cost of living, but also then how it plays out into pressure on audiences' propensity to spend. That's particularly biting Christmas shows, which we might expect because they're kind of maybe less regular attenders on average, and more kind of middle Britain attenders, and so maybe feeling the pinch a bit more. Um, but the difference between each different art form is quite important, and clearly will vary as well on a case by case basis. But hopefully, this gives at least a starting point to start to see there's a richer picture going on than the overall headline figures of our sales up or down in aggregate. So that was quite a lot, which Ben is now going to make elegant sense of in a couple of minutes, or at least put some more fuel on the fire in terms of things to think about. So over to you, Ben.
Okay. Do you want to stop the
Shall we
slide so we
stop
can
sharing?
see everyone? Yeah. So yeah, quite the 5 years. It feels like a bit of a sketch map of how the arts have navigated an era of polycrisis and the long-lasting impacts of the 2008 crash and austerity and Brexit and COVID and war in Ukraine and the cost of living crisis and now tariff inflation. It's definitely been a time of high inflation, and especially on the cost factors of operating theatres, so heat, light, and power. And our audiences, of course, have been impacted too, with widespread indication of reduced leisure spend seen across high streets. We've seen high street closures all over the place as disposable income gets eaten up by rising living, housing, and food costs. And this also sort of intersects with a long-standing trend of reduced real-term funding for many theatres, with a sort of 15 and more year trend of reduced proportion of costs being covered by grants from local authorities and arts councils, therefore leaving theatres more exposed to these challenging market conditions. Basically, audiences and audience income matter more than ever. That's what's driving it. So it feels like the first thing I want to do, because it's all a bit miserable, is to take a moment to congratulate ourselves on making it this far and remaining a vibrant part of high streets and town centres and communities. And today, so we've presented trends as we've seen them in the data. We've got some indication of what might lie behind that and some hunches, but rather than insight, I really have some speculative thoughts about what we're seeing, which I hope will act as prompts for discussion at the end of the session. So do hang around and share your thoughts, because that will help us when we start to dig a little bit deeper, work out what's most valuable to learn. So we plan to do some more digging in detail in forthcoming sessions. I think Ollie was saying we're already planning to dig deeper into Christmas show trends in spring 26 once we have this year's data through, as we know that's like a significant source of income for the sector. But my speculative thoughts, that summary running to standstill feels really apt. So this is the same venues and there's 25% more performances and it's not earning us any more money. That's the definition of running to standstill. Sort of bookings, tickets, and income have broadly returned to pre-COVID levels, which is or exceeded that, which is no small feat. But inflation has been a real killer. So the same is 27.8% lower in terms of, in real terms, CPI. We've not sort of specifically looked at prices, but overall similar booking and income levels now as in 2019 would suggest that pricing changes, if they have been made, have not helped to close that 28% gap, with people on average paying roughly the same amount of pounds for their tickets. So this means that real terms income of performance is down for most art forms, as Ollie was saying, with the exception of musical theatre and music. Musical theatre 13% up and music 7%. It feels like the response to this situation has been to do more events. So that's sort of what are we going to do with the state of the world? More events. And also more events perceived as more commercial, including musical theatre. And I think that spike in 2021 for musicals and children's events was perhaps some of that rush to more commercial events and events that were available to book while production cycles got up and running again. So we've seen that spike come down. We're certainly seeing schedules fill up with more product beyond the usual fare, with very notable rises, at times doubling in general entertainment, so comedy, magic, music, podcasters, those sort of things. Bit of a change in literature, perhaps with more book and author events coming into theatres, and a miscellany of other art forms which incorporate like a really broad range of programming. But we're definitely seeing a significant change in the types of programs. In addition, as Ollie was saying, we've seen this expansion of Christmas show performances, which he and I were talking about. This maybe some theatres doing Christmas shows for the first time, as part of that new sort of more commercial offer, or adding secondary shows for different age groups, and we've seen a bit of that. But I suspect at the core, it's extending runs, so spreading that production cost over more performances into January and into November. Um, and success here seems to have varied, but overall across the cohort, it's not bringing in more people and money. A huge rise in general entertainment seems to have sort of reverted a bit since 2022-23, peaking at 75% increase and dropping to around 30%, still more than pre-COVID levels. And I think in part that initial spike may have been filling a gap, as I say, while production cycles wound back up, but has remained a more significant proportion of the program to date. Right, it still is. Perhaps often low cost, quick to get events in on a split with minimal risk. Lots of drivers for that sort of low risk filling of schedules programming. More events of different types to broader or certainly different audiences suggests to me that marketing departments have probably had to quickly adapt to more events, more varied events, and to finding new audiences for new types of shows. And more of it. But I'm also conscious it could be more venue hires, which could explain increased variety of event types, which would still be in these figures if you're doing the ticket for those hires, which I think is the case. So again, while there are useful broad trends, it's worth digging a bit deeper, which we'll do. It'd be interesting to hear what's useful to you. Overall, though, it's clearly a time of experimentation with lots of new programming models. So as the evidence comes through, it's worth examining not only on this broad sort of general scale, but what's working for you financially and also against your social and artistic goals. Does your experience match these trends? Are new types of events bringing in new audiences for you or spreading existing audiences thinner, which seems to be sort of a suggestion from the overall pattern? I think there's probably still some running standstill to do, but hopefully learning the lessons from what you're seeing in your venues can hopefully make the running a little bit easier. Basically, all this running should be making us fitter. We should be learning as we go and trying to. So I think that's it as a first take. It's sort of more suggestions about what might be driving those trends, and I think you're the people who know. So it'd be really interesting to hear from you. We've got a few minutes left, so I'm going to stop there, and I'm interested to hear if that rings true for you. What your thoughts are, and what you'd like us to dig into further. So I'll